Fort Worth and the chair of the Task Force for Church Planting and Congregational Redevelopment. And the Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. Gracious God, because of your generosity, we are able to celebrate together resurrected life. We ask you to continue your process of resurrection and renewal in us and through us, that your world may know the power of your love. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thanks, Janet. And I'm Katie Nakamura-Ringers, the staff officer for church planting. And I'm calling in from Birmingham, Alabama. Christian, would you introduce yourself next? You're to my right on the screen.
Sure. Yeah, my name is Christian Gillette, and I'm the canon for evangelism and discipleship in the Diocese of San Diego.
Cool.
And yeah, I'm having to kind of rethink all of the stuff I'd been planning for this year. It's been fun, but happy to be here.
Great. And then Sally?
Sally Ulrey from the Diocese of Atlanta on the bishop's staff, work for Canon John Thompson Corti, whose Office of Congregational Vitality. And yeah, that's what I do in Atlanta. Just hanging out and being on lots of Zoom meetings. It's exciting.
I bet. Great. Jim, you're next on my screen.
Thanks. I'm Jim Gettle. I'm canon for congregational life in the Diocese of Michigan. And like many of you, spending a lot of time on phone calls and Zoom meetings, trying to stay as connected as possible with clergy and lay leaders.
Jim, do you like change your background for each Zoom meeting, or
no, this is
at your house?
This is left over from an Easter family meeting, and I didn't change it back, but it's Ireland.
We like it.
The good thing about this working remotely is my wife and daughters live in Milwaukee, so I've been here for a month, which is a real treat.
Nice. Good. And there's Jason Evans.
Hey there, friends. Jason Evans, missioner for missional communities in the Diocese of Texas. So that's me.
You getting up to anything interesting?
Well, spending a lot of time, I mean, like everybody else, lots of Zoom meetings, and trying to help everybody figure out how to pivot, right? Like how to do things. It's still the same call, right? Or it's still the same work, but obviously it's pivoted quite a bit for everybody. So troubleshooting, helping people think about how to do this differently from small rural towns to big churches and big cities and everything in between.
Good, thanks. Gina, I'm glad you could get on.
Thank you. I'm Gina Gore. I'm in the Diocese of New York. I'm in New York City. And I'm on the Congregational Development Committee here, and then also the lead on the church planting efforts for the diocese. And then I work supply in the state.
Good. Yay. And Teresa.
Hi, Katie and everybody. I'm interloping a little bit. I'm a church planter.
We're glad you're here.
Thank you. Church at Crossroads in Detroit. I work with Jim Gettle. So I just really felt like I needed to hear this firsthand today. So thanks.
Good. And Michael.
Hey y'all, I'm Michael Cheney. I am in the Diocese of Georgia. I'm a multi-vocational priest in Savannah with a church plant called the Church of the Epiphany.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. That's all the faces and names that I see. Is there anybody else on that I missed? I don't think so. All right, good. So we've developed this new term of being all zoomed out. And I know that while we'd set aside 90 minutes for these conversations, this is a smaller group and hopefully we can have some good intimate conversation, but we probably don't need all 90 all 90 minutes, unless Jason's planning to, give a really long presentation.
I am happy to accommodate and abbreviate. Yeah.
Nice. But I have pushed record. So once the recording is out, I'll email it out and put it on Facebook. And if it's something you want to share with anybody, with diocesan staff members or church planters that please do. I'll try to edit out maybe some of our introductions. It felt important to have one of these conversations be related to developing some understanding of what success means in this kind of church planting work, as well as some talking about what would be the tangible outcomes that we're looking for. And as many of you know, because you've been part of some of these conversations, the Task Force on Church Planting has begun requiring a covenant conversation with diocesan leaders and the church planters for any new Episcopal community receiving funding. And one of the things that's been interesting for me is asking some of our planters and leaders what success might mean for them. And I'm fairly certain that when I started planting 6 years ago here in Birmingham, I would not have known how to answer that question. Partly because we were planting something very different. It wasn't a traditional church plant. It was a coffee shop and smaller Episcopal worshiping community all into one. So kind of a fresh expression, an emerging church, whatever you want to call it. And I'm hearing some of that on our covenant calls. Folks defining success as the transformation of lives through the gospel, which is right on, right? Or bringing together people into a community that really represents the kingdom of God and its diversity and inclusiveness, which is, again, right on. But there's also this question of how do we actually measure that? How do we do a ministry review and talk about what that means? How do we know that we're living into those outcomes that we're desiring? And also, how does a ministry know that it's on track to sustain that level of work? And so I asked Jason Evans, who just introduced himself, if he'd talk to us some about what they're doing in Texas and other ways he's just observed in his experience with church plants about how they're defining and measuring success. So Jason, I'm going to turn it over to you. And if you want to present, and then we can probably engage in some conversation about this.
Sure. Well, we are a smaller group, so I invite you to unmute yourself and ask questions, engage as much as you would like. I know that we've all probably facilitated Zooms where we were hoping people would mute that weren't muting, and let's just say that doesn't have to be this meeting. So if you want to unmute, as long as you're not eating carrots in your mic, we would love to hear, or corn chips or whatever. I think we'd love to hear what you have in mind. So as Katie was mentioning, there's this Genesis Task Force that looks at the grants that are coming towards the churchwide office for the work of church planting and mission enterprises across the church. And as she also mentioned, there's these covenant conversations where members of the task force are calling and talking to people on a diocesan level about the work that's going to be done and how the resources are going to be used if they get the grant. And there's often, you can hear a different set of understanding of what is to be measured, or maybe what is better put as what is valued versus what the diocese values. There's also this interesting point where we are in our history as the church in the West and as a tradition, where oftentimes positions of power are reluctant in some situations to actually articulate what it is that they value or what it is that they want to measure, because they don't want to impose that on the context. It's as if it has some reflection of like a colonizing behavior of sorts of enforcing something on a local context that hasn't been desired by a local context. And that can cause all sorts of challenges from my experience if you are hoping to try to get clear on both ends of the spectrum, the people on the local level and then those on adjudicatory level of what is the goal of a particular ministry. What is it that we're trying to accomplish there? So one of the things that, and I think I mentioned this last time I was on one of these calls, that I think is really important is getting clear on what it is that you value. Because for planters, so Teresa, you said you're here because you're a planter, and you have probably experienced this, most planters have, that if a planter doesn't articulate, here's what we value, here's what we are measuring, this is the story we are trying to tell, it gets told for you. The metrics, the values get placed upon you as the planter, and sometimes that's purposefully. I've certainly done that when I've seen a planter that is reluctant to name what their goals are. I feel inclined to say, great, here are your goals then, if you don't have goals. But negotiating that, getting clear on what it is that we are measuring is really important. And so I'm going to just go to some notes that I have on this. I mentioned this last time I talked with you all, but there's this book by a Methodist leader named Gil Rendell. It's called Doing the Math of Mission, that I have found really helpful. It's a short book, and it actually just kind of skims over the basics of this. But for me, and this was crystallized after reading Gil's book, what got clearer for me in reading his book was there's 3 categories that we needed to think about when we're determining how we're going to measure things in our ministry, in a missional ministry, in a new start of some kind. And that's, we need to think about the resources. So if it's easy to think about it this way, this is like things like our assets. This is the human resources that we have. This is the money that we have, the property, the assets, the nouns of a ministry. We need to think about those things as part of the metric. But then the second thing is the activities. What are the things that we do? These are the verbs, the things that we are doing as a new ministry that we need to keep track of. So our worship activities, the acts of service we do in a community, the ways that we gather for building community and fellowship. What are those things that we're doing in that regard, and what are those assets? But then the last thing that seems really important to me, and we probably don't spend as much time as we ought to in most traditional contexts, is outcomes. What is the difference made by these resources and activities? What is the difference because of those things? And the way Rendell talks about it is he talks about resources as kind of like your inputs, the things that you have to do your activities, which he refers to as your throughputs, so that you can get to your outcomes. So in other words, our default, and what he does is he kind of differentiates between inputs and throughputs as counting, and outputs or outcomes as what you measure. That the difference or change that is to be accomplished is what you are measuring. And it's a bit of a difference between quantitative and qualitative. But we have found that these are both important, because I think what we have experienced in our current context is there is often a reluctance to make numbers the primary thing, right? We don't want it to just be all about the numbers. And I hear that. I think that that's appropriate. But the reason why is because we're unclear about the outcome, right? Like we have human resource. We have a certain number of people gathered. What are they gathered to do? They're gathered to worship or to be a part of a prayer service, to serve the community in some certain way. And the reason why we're reluctant to talk about the numeric piece is because we're not clear on what it is that we want to measure as an outcome. Like, what is different because we had that resource and that activity together? What did it make possible? And that's the thing that I think is one of the most important pieces to spend as much time as you can with your planters on, is getting clear of what does this community, this new plant that we're doing, what does it make possible in the world that wasn't here before? What happens because of this community? And then what happens is you start to be able to tell a story, right? You can start to say, well, this thing exists now. This thing happened. and it was because of these different things. And we can start to say, well, you know, we had X amount of people that participated in this thing, and this is the outcome of that. So it's important for no matter what measurement we're talking about, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, it's important to think about what does that mean. So some of the things that Katie, you mentioned, you talked about, you know, transformation. That's great. That's awesome. What for? What are people being transformed for? You talked about inclusivity. That's awesome too. Inclusive for what reason? What is made possible by a Christian community saying we're inclusive? What is possible because of that? And so I think that thinking through these types of things, your inputs, your throughputs, and your outputs are really helpful for helping planters get clear on the story that they're wanting to tell, and what are the things that they need to be measuring. So I'll give you just a real quick example. One of our planters who was super active, high energy, always getting stuff done, whenever I would try to ask them about what they were getting done, they always talked to me about how many pounds of food they served. And I was consistently frustrated with that, because I thought, I don't understand what story, I didn't understand what story he was trying to tell, right? And it took us time to figure out a language, but it was, I think, helpful on both of our parts, because it helped me understand the story he was trying to tell, not just to the people that were part of their faith community, but to the broader community. In other words, his work of actually serving people in need was in an effort to generate and develop goodwill amongst the broader community. Because living in a 21st century Western context, we do not live in an era where our neighbors trust the church the way they did in an era past. And he recognized if he wanted people to be able to hear the good news that the church was offering in Jesus Christ, that they had to actually trust the church. And that one way he could do that was by making it incredibly clear that his interest was as much in the goodwill of the surrounding community as any of the other nonprofit organizations or local government or neighbors and citizens within that context. As much as they desired the goodwill, they did as a church plant as well. And so that's why I'm saying the pounds of food that they served on a regular basis was so important to him. But you can see how, like, when I was just asking a question about, well, how many people are showing up and how often are you meeting? We were on a different path. And so the bottom line is for most of us here that are on diocesan staff, it is the hard metrics that matter to us, right? We need to know those things. But I think it is incredibly important as well that we understand how they connect with a planter's qualitative metrics, often, as well as quantitative metrics, in a particular context. Because it helps us understand the story that they are trying to tell. And those are things that we can't come up with. We can't determine that narrative in and of ourselves of what the story that is going to be told in a ministry context. That is up to the planter and that community that is developing there. But beginning a conversation about trying to get clear on that is really helpful. Since we're small enough just to have conversation, why don't I just stop right there? Does that make sense to you? Or do you have questions about that?
So Jason, would you talk a little bit, kind of extend this line? Would you connect, how would you connect, or would you connect success and sustainability? And would you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So, yeah, I was hoping we could get there. Absolutely. So the thing that we have figured out in the Diocese of Texas is that we needed to figure out how we were going to give ourselves and our missional leaders permission to name when things were intended to exist for a season and when things needed to exist for a sustained period of time. In other words, that the Episcopal Church, and if you've spent time outside of the Episcopal Church, you know this to be true. If not, it's important to know that our tradition tends to fund mission in large numbers and small numbers for a much longer period of time than most other traditions do. That's neither right or wrong. It's just the way it is across a lot of the Episcopal Church. And the reason why I mention that is because what happens is the longer we're invested in a community, is it often allows us to not have the conversation about what is the intended lifespan of what we are offering, what in this new effort, and how do we exit this thing gracefully, or how do we ensure that it is around for the foreseeable future? So the first thing we started doing is trying to create a conversation, and then we started around that question of, does this need to exist for a season, or is this something that needs to be sustained over a period of time? And then looking at funding in a way that allowed us to have that conversation over a period of time and not surprise people with that. And so generally speaking, in our diocese, we're looking at, when we give someone a grant to start a community, we're looking at 5 years. 5 to 7 years is about average what's going on across most dioceses, and the diocese that I've had conversations with. But what we've done is we've tried to frame our funding in a way that we don't have the peak of funding is not the beginning of something. In other words, we create an on-ramp to funding, ensuring that there's enough for people to seed experiments and try things out, so that we can get clear on those things that we are going to be measuring. So is it people? Is it a number of services? Is it whatever those metrics are that we think will tell us whether or not this ministry can be sustained over a period of time? And what we do is, as we get into usually the second or third year, we have those conversations about whether or not this looks like it is something that is intended to exist for a season, or something that's going to be sustained. And we start, so from the very beginning, in our context, we talk about what we think it looks like for a congregation to survive financially in a given context, what we think that looks like in pledges. If you use Mission Insight, you can go and you can look at what the average income of a particular area is. And so you can get a pretty clear idea as diocesan staff what kind of income levels are to be anticipated in an area you're doing a new ministry. And then if you look at what your giving is in that part of the diocese, you can get a pretty good idea of what's a potential rate of giving in that particular area. But what we've learned is that it usually takes 2 to 3 years. If you're starting with people that aren't exposed to church previously in a church plant, it takes 2 to 3 years to turn that person into a giver. So you need some time to, as those people come in and they're learning what it is to participate financially in a new church, to get to the point where you can see what giving is looking like. We also have taken that and then looked at, like, well, how many of those types of people that would give that at that level, how many of them do you need in a congregation for it to be sustainable? And so we try to do all of that math on the front end of things before we even start, so that we can have conversations with people early on about, this is what we think it looks like in this context for this to be sustainable. That you would need X amount of givers giving at approximately this amount of money to be able to pay the bills of this church plant. The benefit of that is that it really helps us, it helps the planter be clear on what their expectations are if they want to build something that's going to be sustainable, but also to understand the limits of the diocese. We talk about it right up front about, here is the total cap over a 5-year period we could provide for this project. So if a planter or mission entrepreneur has that number and looks at what they think giving could look like over a period of time, they can figure out what other fundraising they need to do, or grants that they need to apply for, especially if they're a mission enterprise zone. There's a lot more flexibility oftentimes for them figuring out different grants they might qualify, if they're, depending on what kind of a missional enterprise project they have. And that makes it a lot simpler for our relationship, because there's no ambiguity. They're clear on what the financial commitment is from day one over the course of the time of that period of time. They understand what we estimate as realistic numbers for how many people need to participate in order to support a quarter-time person, full-time person, whatever that is determined, what it's going to cost to rent in that area, if you need to rent space or what have you. We try to get clear on as many of those expenses and costs up front with people and say, we think that it would take X amount of people giving it X amount of rate to make it possible in this particular context. And recognizing those are estimates where they're never perfect, but they allow us to at least have a benchmark for us to have continued conversations. So that way, when we get to year 2 or 3, and we start to look at what the rates of giving are and how many people are beginning to participate and the regularity of gathering, we can already be at that place where we can say, is this becoming what we thought it was going to become? Is it something different than what we anticipated it to be? Is God taking us in a completely different direction? And if it's clear to both the planter and the diocesan office that you know what, we thought we were planting a brick and mortar church, the numbers aren't there. It's not heading in the direction we had anticipated. We still have committed to a certain enough of funding of the project. We committed ahead of time so that we can say, well, we can wind this down gracefully, help people find a new community, whatever it looks like, rather than just shutter the project. You know, okay, well, we messed up. This isn't what we thought it would be. We're done. And at the same time, if it's not something that does need to be shuttered, but is something that it looks like this is going to take off, this is going to work, we have a few years where we can wind down the funding that we have given, and they have that cushion for them to continue to build up their other income streams. One of the things that we have found, though, I'll add this and then I'll shut up and we'll see what other questions and thoughts that everybody else has about this. But we have found that our assumption generally is in our circles that the church needs to have one stream of income. And so that's either the diocesan support or the church-wide office through the diocese or givers, pledgers. And we have found that to be not true at all in the 21st century. And that what we need to continually be doing is thinking about how building a wider base of support from a variety of streams of income. And so that has been an important piece of it for us. We have communities that they get a check every other month from somebody that doesn't even go to their church, but thinks what they're doing in the community is important enough for them to give. But considering that in the 20th century, giving is just different. Having multiple streams of income has seemed to be an important thing, but giving planters some sort of an on-ramp to slowly get there. Is anybody else hearing that really strange noise in the background? It's like we got a robot in conversation with us here.
I think I muted.
Okay, great. If that was us being Zoom bombed, that was my first Zoom bombing. So that was pretty mellow from what I've heard. Anyways, so that's how we've been approaching sustainability, is trying to create a time for a window of time. So if you have a bulk of money, finding a way to stretch that out and not just making it a dump all at once, so you can figure out how to sustain this thing over a period of time, and helping the local leaders figure out what actually is realistic in their context. I'll stop there. Let's see what else we've got.
Jason, I came on late because I was involved in another webinar and my computer protested a day-long exercise in Zoom meetings, and it rebooted without my asking it to. But I heard you mention Rendell, and I was wondering who that was. That Gilbert Rendell you're drawing from, or?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. And I'm not clear yet because I've read his stuff, but the throughputs was a fascinating term for me. I'd have to go back and look again, but one of the things that I would say it's a learning I learned while doing a church plant, and maybe didn't learn it soon enough, was that you can't control the outputs. You can hope for certain outputs in terms of critical mass and money and all the things we're talking about. But what you can control is your inputs. You know, how many contextual engagement events you have, how many one-on-ones you do, how many people your launch team invites per month to events. Those are the things you can metrically control, more so than outputs. So I guess what I would like to see in our working with mission developers is to get them focused on, yes, we need to get here ultimately, but what is it going to take to get there? What kind of input events do we need to have? How much witnessing do we need to do? How many direct mailings do we need to do, et cetera, to get to point B? Because you can't control the outputs, but you can set goals for inputs, and those you can do. And somehow in our discussions with mission developers and diocesan leadership, I would hope for more of a focus on front end, front loading that rather than front loading the outputs, if that makes any sense.
I hear you. I feel as though I feel as though it's important to do both. I feel like, especially what I'm hearing across, and I'd be curious to hear what some of the other diocesan leaders here think about this, but I hear a reluctance to actually name the metrics. And so that's why I guess I'm actually thinking it's important to get clear on what it is that you want as an outcome, because that gives you permission to talk about, like, well, then what is it going to take for us to get there?
That's exactly what I'm saying. You know, that you need to know where you're going to get in order to be sustainable. We have to get to this point to be sustainable, but in order to get there, this is what we have to do. So if we could put, I guess I'm saying, more focus on the front end piece as critical to be intentional about the kinds of inputs you can create, and you metrically do that on the front end to get to the end. I suppose I think you're right. We're too tentative about the metrics and about talking about numbers. Well, they did count how many people were at the feeding of the 5,000.
That's right. That's right.
They knew how many were there. So there's something, you have to do the metrics if you want sustainability. I suppose what I'm saying is, in our training and in our conversations, we need to do both. And I'm sensing we're not doing enough of the former, giving people more a sense of how important the intentionality is on the input side to get to the outcomes.
One thing that I think is important about both those kind of the inputs and outcomes, sorry, Janet, if I cut you off, I apologize. I think it's one of the reasons why it's important to figure out how you are telling a story that connects the two of them, is because that is what communicates a value added equation for the people that would participate in it. If you have somebody that's new to your community, and they hear you talking about, like, we had X amount of confirmations last year or baptisms, they need to know why that's important. They need to know what that makes different in the life of that community, and in the broader neighborhood, for that to matter to them. And so figuring out what the conversation with both of those things, I think, is really important. Christian, you were going to say something?
Yeah, I know, kind of talking about outputs. I've found in my experience that, you can start with sort of those goals of outputs, but they oftentimes evolve. I mean, as a community develops and grows, I mean, I've started out with kind of a goal and an output, and it ended up with something very, very different. Just as, new people join, and, just things change directions. And how do you leave space for that kind of evolution, and still connect it to metrics and have something that kind of moves in the same direction?
I think it requires an ongoing conversation, and not so much, well, I think it's important for the diocese and the planter to have that conversation, but maybe even more so on a local level. It can very well be a part of how we form people spiritually, is to have them involved in the conversation of, what is this community for? What does it make possible in the world? what does it mean to be a part of this? What defines us? What are our values? I've never seen a new community where that had any kind of success where they didn't articulate some of that up front. And yes, you're right. Those are more aspirational. They're not data driven, but they are what the community, a primary leader, a planter is aspiring for that community to be accomplishing. But as the process goes along, engaging people in that conversation of what does it mean to be a part of this community? What are the things that we value? And it's incredibly informative. And you've probably experienced this, Christian, that when you have that conversation with people, you begin to realize, oh, wow, this isn't what I thought it was. I thought we were saying this is what we valued and we thought this was important in the world. And yet I'm hearing reflected back to me something different. And that is either an opportunity for course correction or an evolution of what the work is. But I still think it's important to start off with those aspirational goals of what you hope to accomplish, and at least being realistic about what is required for it to actually get to a place of sustainability, and then and pivoting as necessary as you go along. I've known a lot of congregations that have rules of life that they reevaluate those on an annual basis. They'll talk about their rule of life as a congregation, etc. That is a perfect time to also do this kind of work, because at least annually stepping back and saying, who are we as a community? What are we accomplishing? What are the things we value? What does it mean to be a part of this community? I think even in this moment that we're experiencing right now, this is critically important. I just talked to the congregation, I guess it was on Monday, that was saying, and this is a church that does not have an incredible online presence before 4 weeks ago, nothing routine whatsoever online. And over the last 2 Sundays, they've had people from Tokyo and London participate in worship. Not what they planned, but 2 weeks straight, those people showed up. What happens if those people would continue to show up week after week? What if they start to give? Like, the rules for what it means to be a part of a community are changed by what's going on in the world right now. And so we need to have enough flexibility that we can ask that question as time goes on.
I agree with that. Just the importance of ongoing, continual communication, and hopefully there's somebody on a diocesan level, as some of you are, who are open and able to engage that kind of conversation about when pivots start to happen. Pivots in model, which actually we're talking about on Thursday with a church planter who pivoted pretty greatly, but also some pivots in mission and hoped for outcomes. It's so crazy. The Genesis gathering was in Birmingham this year at not a recently planted church, but a church that was planted in 1970, early 70s. And by all worldly metrics, it's successful, profoundly successful, just had multi-million-dollar capital campaign. It's beautiful. The people are lovely. And yet some of the folks who were there at the very beginning with the church planter, who are now in their 80s, will say, this is not what our original mission was. Our original mission was to be a church for the blue collar workers out in this suburb who worked in the steel mills. And we wanted it to cap out at 100 people. And of course they're still there. And so they're happy with the direction that it took. But it's interesting that even, as a community develops, as a neighborhood develops, the mission is gonna adjust, hopefully. Janet, were you gonna say something earlier?
Nope, I was just trying to help Christian get in.
Thank you for
Katie, I had a question about the church in Birmingham. Haven't they been the launching pad for 4 other church starts?
At least, I think they claim even more than that.
More than that. I'd be curious to know whether some of those beehives or whatever kinds of plants they did look more like their original vision for who they were. That would be a fun question to look at.
You know what? It would. It really would. None of them, they're all suburban, and so none of them is catering to, none of them is serving a blue collar or lower income area anymore. but they're much smaller.
I would love to hear from those of you who haven't spoken. Like, is this striking you as like crazy or helpful or?
This is Michael. This is fantastic. You know, assessing both goals and outcomes, thinking about long-term strategy in relation to your mission, I think is really helpful to hear this. I've been taking copious notes. So I just want to say thanks.
That's great. Glad it's helpful.
This is John, and I'm here with Sally. We work together in Atlanta. I came in late because I was coming from another Zoom meeting, but I'm encouraged by what I heard, and I can't wait to go back and listen to the whole conversation. One of the notes, something I made about myself about David's comment. Yes, we you know, the outcomes are not within our control, but it's measurable still. You know, you can evaluate the outcomes, and I think that what I heard from Jason's presentation is something I do with vestries a lot, which is why do you want to do this ministry? You know, what was your purpose for doing this ministry? Because then, you know, if there are 10 people and each of them have different vision of what the ministry was going to yield, then they'll be spinning their wheels and frustrating themselves. So it's good to be able to couch the setting cohesive vision that they can all work towards. And then when you evaluate, you can actually measure those. So this is very helpful, really, really helpful. We're taking baby steps here in Atlanta and trying to launch New Starts. And so we are just soaking all of these. Yes, and you know that because
I'm so glad to hear that, John.
Yes, and we are.
I'm in your corner. I'm your fan, John.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, and I think one of the things that has been helpful for us is having these conversations early on and getting clearer on what it is we're aspiring to accomplish between the planter and the diocesan office really allows us to be realistic about things. You know, if someone is wanting to, you know, like Katie, not only plant a faith community, but open a coffee house, well, that really needs to be funded differently than the person that says, I really am just hoping to gather 20 people in my living room, and that's all I want to accomplish. The importance of those two things has no difference in the scope of the kingdom, probably, but they probably have a big difference on how we fund them and what our expectations are. And so having those kinds of conversations early on and having it be a dialogue is really, really important. And there are plenty of house churches that have turned into large congregations, and there are lots of people that have aspired to plant mega churches that have never gotten further than 15 people in their living rooms. And so I think creating that space for us to at least talk about what it is we're aspiring to accomplish with any given leader or a group of leaders allows us to have an ongoing realistic conversation about it. It takes the anxiety out of the conversation too. I think the anxiety can be experienced on either end by the diocese not wanting to, you know, to be a wet blanket and say, gosh, we can only do this much financially or whatever whatever that is. Or it can be on the end of the planter or entrepreneurial leader reluctant to just talk about numbers. So starting that conversation early on and taking some of the mystery out of it and the ambiguity of it allows both to kind of function with a level of clarity and expectation out of each partner. That is, I have, having worked in contexts that were resource rich and resource lean, I think that's been helpful in both contexts to have that level of clarity on the front end of things.
Jason, we're not doing, at least in this series, like a talk on the graceful exit.
Yeah.
But what thoughts do you have on that? You know, kind of that you were talking about at that year 2 or 3-ish mark, you start having conversations about, are these the outcomes that we hoped for? If they're not, are they worth sustaining for a while, or do we begin to make plans for winding this down in a life-giving way? How do those conversations go, and what kind of best practices would you offer for that?
I think it's kind of the same with being a supervisor with an employee. A lot of times, in any number of different contexts, the assumption is that everybody has an annual review, right? That's what everybody has, is okay. Or at least in most contexts, we would hope that there would be at least be an annual review. But as any good supervisor comes to find out, that it's really hard to have a good annual review if you don't have periodic reviews throughout the year, right? That point to take a step back and say, how are we doing? Are we accomplishing the things that we were aspiring to accomplish? What changes do we need to make? So if that end of the year review is going to coincide with a bonus or a raise or not, there's context for that. And it's the same with, I think, starting new ministries, that we need to have periodic points where we stop and say, what's working? What's not working? What do we need to celebrate? What do we need to retool or consider that we need to stop? So that when we get to that point where we really need to have a conversation about whether this is a ministry that is going to go on through perpetuity or not, we are prepared for that conversation. What's happening in that is that you're taking the frustration or worry about making mistakes and failure out of the equation. You're allowing it to just be a part of how we do ministry, that risk is required, that mistakes are going to happen, that we're going to experiment with things that are not going to work. It allows it to be a part of the conversation. So when you come to that point in year 2 or 3 to say, is this going to survive? Is this going to be something that would be able to be self-sustainable or not require diocesan funding at some point? That is an easier conversation because you've been prepared for that conversation. And honestly, the more we're disciplined about that, the more surprised in a good way we can be, because we're giving permission for people to be creative, innovative, experiment, try new things. And you may get to year 2 or 3 and people will be like, you know what, we thought this is what we were going to do, but actually we're going in this direction. It's this thing now. We thought we were doing a food truck, but no, we're actually doing a brick and mortar church, or whatever it is the conversation needs to be in that moment. That can happen if you've tilled the soil of freedom for that kind of conversation and thinking to happen. So I think that's the best advice I would give on that front, Katie.
Yeah, I love that. And I think there's this, like you were saying, this permission giving to experiment and to innovate and to fail and to risk, right? And then my guess is that there's frequently some church planters that are not doing so well that need the permission, right, to say, you know what, we risked it. It was beautiful. It didn't work the way we wanted it to. You can go find another job.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And think about what is possible if we are the tradition that normalizes that and can figure out ways to do that with a level of grace, rather than risking the opportunity. I mean, think about, most church planters in our tradition are, I'm at least think actually go back and look at the numbers. We should think about this as a task force. But I'm assuming that the highest percentage is clergy, that it is priests primarily that are planting new communities. And they take 3 to 5 to 7 years, maybe longer, on a church planting project. And it doesn't work. What would happen if the doors get closed on that expression, that new church, but with grace, and it's not seen as a failure, but as something we've learned that, gosh, we tried this thing and for a while it did something really beautiful, and then we had to walk away from it at a particular point. I love the way that happened with Janet and in her diocese in Fort Worth, where they had a plant and it didn't work out, but it was gracious. Like, there was the healthy dialogue to the point where it could be said, like, you know what, we've learned some really valuable things that'll benefit this diocese for the future in its church planting work. But this one, it didn't work out. And it wasn't a stain on that priest's record. They went on to a wonderful job in a different diocese. But what would be possible in our diocese if we were able to frame missional opportunities, whether they succeed or fail, as lessons learned that we can apply? And we had leaders that didn't feel like they were going into this well, like I'm putting my career on the line. My well-being and security is on whether or not this works, but rather it was framed around being faithful to the mission that God has called us to, and learning how to more faithfully participate in that as time goes on.
Another thing I think that those regular conversations allow is, if the diocesan personnel are in regular contact with their church planters, and I don't think it's any, I think as diocesan staff, we have to say, if we're going to have a church plant in our diocese, this is going to require not just throwing some money at it, but some mentoring and some additional time on behalf of the diocesan staff. That's part of our leadership role. It's part of what somebody who is doing something that's not the norm needs from us. Yeah. So, but another thing I think those regular conversations facilitate is they allow, and you've said this basically, they allow you to change your mind even about smaller things that exist, not exist. But like, and this happened in our diocese because of the split in the lawsuit. Like, some congregations have come to the point that it's like they need a building. A building is not an albatross around their neck, but for that community, a building with a pointy roof and a narthex and a parish hall is a thing for them as a community. And for other congregations, they're like, we really don't need, we'll meet somewhere where we can pay like a little bit on lease and use all of the rest of that money that we could be putting into a building for ministry. And here's those ministries that we're going to do. I think that ongoing conversation and permission giving on behalf by the bishop and the diocesan staff changes the culture and allows even the congregations that are traditional, quote unquote, to experiment and to have some ownership in the experiments that the diocese is undertaking. Yeah. With their money, by the way, if it's diocesan.
Right. Yeah. That's so good. What other thoughts do some of you that haven't shared? What other thoughts do you have?
This is Michael again. I just put over in the comment section a couple of things about that I'm hearing. I think speaking from a clergy and a church planter perspective, this idea of permission giving and latitude for experimenting is really vital to success. And I kind of come to that as an artist and an educator in the arts. There's a lot of connection here. You learn by failing, and when you fail forward. I think as a church planter now going into my second year with this community, I'm learning a lot of things about what I thought my goals were a year and a half ago for this community, and what the community's needs are and how those are redefining what goals might be.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Janet. I got really heavily stepped on by somebody for using the phrase permission giving. And the argument was, we shouldn't be an institution that gives permission and, doesn't give permission. We should be a flat, kind of institution. I love flat institutions. I think you can accomplish some things in flat institutions that you can't in hierarchical institutions, but guess what? We are an hierarchical institution. We just are. And so we might as well just fess up to that and say that in our systems, there are some things that are not possible without the people who have the power or are perceived to have the power giving permission.
Yeah. Well, Michael mentioned being an artist, and I think that, what artists know is that some of their most creative work comes out of when they have limits, right? Like the canvas can only be so big, but you have to work with the limits of whatever your canvas is, whatever medium you're working with. And I think it's the same thing for most of our creative leaders in mission work is that they do need to have some clarity about the limits of what the institution can do, and what they can do too. You know, that's part of one of the helpful conversations, having them periodically with the people out in the field is making sure you're clear, like, oh, that's great, but we're Episcopalians, so we do certain things and we don't do certain things. So let's talk about that. But you know, it's much better to have those conversations earlier on than get, you know, 18 months, 24 months down the road and be like, oh gosh, we planted a Universalist church and we didn't know it, or whatever it is, you know. Not to be disparaging against Universalists. Know some lovely Universalists.
I'm Gina. I'm in New York. Thank you so much for this. It's all just so thought-provoking and also reflective back on a church I was with that was planted over 10 years ago. You know, it's really causes me to sort of go back and reevaluate so many parts of that journey. Right now, what I just feel really focused on is the way in which we're planting these new seeds right now in a different way. And like Jason, you mentioned, you know, this church there that doesn't normally have an online presence or a live presence or whatever, and now they're reaching people all over. And I'm finding that in the biggest way. So I supply at a church right now up in the Orange County area of New York. And there's I just dropped in to supply for them Lent through, well, basically Lent through Easter, but now I'm staying on because they need me to, and I'm happy to. But so I barely know them. But the point is, their ASA is usually about 40, and we have easily 100 or more coming to every online live and viewing it and sharing it. You know, the first week, two people shared it. The second week, 10 people shared it. And I think we're in this incredible time of having to rethink what, not even knowing when this is going to end and when we're going to be back together, but knowing that we're reaching people that we never reached before, and they still might not come in the church on Sunday. And so what is that going to look like? And how do we keep that going? Because I sense from a lot of colleagues in New York that are really stretched in so many ways for their online presence right now, that when we're back in person, a great many of them are going to be like, phew, thank God that's over. When really, I have people from this community writing to me saying, please tell me this isn't going to stop. So I don't know if I'm going way off topic, but you know, I don't know what that outcome looks like. All I know is that the income is that we've got to keep, or just, I don't know, just trying to really listen and ask the questions I need to ask and find out what they need and get to know these people when I'm not physically there and we're all in this boat. So I don't know. That's what I'm thinking about.
That's really, thank you for sharing that, Gina. First of all, I think I'm really grateful that everybody here is healthy and whole, and it is a really strange moment, but I don't think it's a total segue to another conversation, Gina, because I think it actually relates, because it's a question of what are we measuring? Like across the church, participation in services has expanded immensely. There's seen a lot of growth. And part of that is due to the exponential quality of these platforms that we're sharing our services on, right? So like you were just mentioning, if somebody has, 100 and some people that follow them on Facebook or are friends with them on Facebook, and they share the service on their profile, then all of those people get exposed to it, which means their networks could get exposed to it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which is fascinating and is interesting. But again, the question of what we're measuring is really important. So one of the things that we have started to talk about locally here is, well, what's the difference between the views of our worship services versus engagement? And on all the platforms that we're using, whether that be Facebook or YouTube or Zoom, we can look at those numbers and distinguish the difference between views of a worship service and engagement. And engagement is going to be telling us the amount of people that are responding to things. So they're putting things in the comments, they're putting emojis and like buttons and heart buttons and whatever else they can be doing during the worship service. And that's really important and may be more important for what we do moving forward. So you're right. A lot of people are going to get to the end whenever the end of this is. And we know we're not going back to normal. There's going to be a new normal after all of this, right? But they're going to just, wipe the sweat off their brow and be like, gosh, thanks. Thank God that's over, that I don't have to do that anymore. And to a degree, there might be some truth to that. There may be some things that we don't need to continue doing, but it's important for us to go and look a little deeper than just like, gosh, we got 120 views on that worship service, and look a little bit deeper at the metrics to see, well, what's important, because we're not actually a consumer religious goods and services type of tradition. Our worship, the DNA of our tradition is engagement, right? There's call and response. There are things that the clergy do, and there are things that the laity do in participation in worship, that there's this flow of back and forth, and it can't happen with just one group in the room. We need to be there participating in it together to fully experience the worship that is in our DNA as a tradition. So it's important to look at those numbers of engagement and see like, well, gosh, how are people engaging online? What does that mean for us moving forward? If we're hoping to engage with those people moving forward, that we need to accentuate and continue to do, and what things do we need to minimize, and what things do we need to just cut and not do anymore? So we may be able to wipe the sweat off our brow and say like, gosh, well, we don't have to do those things anymore. But if we look at the metrics and we determine what it is that is important for us because of what we aspire to be as a tradition and as a local expression of that, we may find there are things that we need to continue to do online that we never would have estimated doing before. I work with a church plant that is very postmodern, but also very Anglo-Catholic, and was very confident and proud of the fact that they had a very limited online presence. There were certain things they would never do online because of their reverence for the tradition, even though they were very hip and cool the way they did it. And this whole thing has completely blown that out of the water. They can't not be online in some ways. And so they've had to, like Christian was pointing us towards, they had to pivot and think about some things differently. But it's required them also to kind of mine the information available to them to really discover, well, what are people actually really responding to? Because we know for us as a tradition, we're not just here for people to just bop in and get their religious goods and services and go, observe somebody else be holy in another screen, but it's a community. So what are the things that we need to continue doing? And some of those things they never thought they would have to continue doing, but they're learning through this experience. We need to continue to offer these things. These things, not so much, but these things we need to continue doing.
And that question of community, what is a community, is going to be huge, I think. When I came into the Episcopal Church, one of the reasons I became an Episcopalian was because there was a great newcomers program and a great adult confirmation program in the church where I became an Episcopalian. And they were really clear from the beginning, like part of, like physical presence in the community, regular giving of money, M-O-N-E-Y, money, and regular service, both interior to the congregation and in the community. Like none of those were optional extra. Like if you signed on to be an Episcopalian in that congregation, that was the deal. And they tied all of that to the wider tradition. And, and I do think that that we're going to have to explore this question of what what is an online community? So the people in London and Tokyo or wherever, like, what are we going to ask of them? How are they going to be community together and not just holy lurkers? I mean, if we're not careful, what this season now will become is kind of only a new monasticism, you know, kind of people in their own little huts, houses, whatever, doing their own thing. And that's not terrible, but it's also not the Episcopal Church as we currently know it. And it's certainly, you know, your holy hut is not a community. So how are we gonna be together?
I think you're right. There's actually a lot of good work that's been done on this subject matter by people in secular contexts. There's actually a book, and I have it right on my shelf. It's called Get Together. This was penned by 3 different authors that I think they all worked for different large social media companies like Instagram, Twitter, etc. And it's actually not just a read, it's almost like a workbook, but it's really beautiful. It has spaces for you to fill in and answer questions. So it's something that you could use, but this was really a response to the question of what do you do with a generation? It's all, the authors are younger than most of us, but we're trying to answer the question, what do you do with a generation that this is primarily how they have built relationships is through the internet? Like, whether it's people they met at school, in middle school, they still connect mostly through these. And so how do you actually engender authentic community? So that I recommend that book as a resource for thinking, but there's obviously things you're going to tweak and do differently because you're the church and the authors that wrote it are not, but it's a great tool.
Any others?
Jason, I'd be interested, you were talking about metrics for financial sustainability and some of that. Do you have metrics for engagement of ministry leaders or of people in the community, and a sense of tying that to outcomes?
Yeah, that's a really great question. When we have talked about engagement in a community, we've talked usually about it around a percentage. So we will say, what percentage of your people that are participating in worship are participating in service and outreach, issues of justice off campus, or from wherever you gather for worship primarily, with a goal of moving more and more people into regular and active engagement with the surrounding community. And I think you can use that with established congregations and new communities as well. Another thing that I think is important is to do work around reflection of the surrounding neighborhood. Now, I recognize that not all new communities are built around a particular neighborhood or people that live within proximity to each other. It is I have found the easiest way to begin to build a new congregation, a new community. But in thinking that, in any case, whether it's a commuter, people are commuting from different parts of an area, or it's from the local neighborhood, to ask if we are reflecting in our worship the community, so that you can get those demographics really easily through the church-wide office's website. But as we develop, are we looking just like the leader, or are we looking like the neighborhood? And I think that those are really important to grapple with over time. It might be an invitation to bring in some other tools about cross-cultural engagement and things like that as time goes on. Janet, were you hoping to say something there?
I just want you to say something about your 1,000 one-on-one guideline.
Oh, well, I mean, I think that as a general rule, there's something about 1,000 points of contact that seem to generate, it at least gives us some sense of whether or not something is going to be sustainable or not. There's something about that number of, we have had 1,000 points of contact, one-on-ones within a particular context. Now that can't happen by one person overnight, even within a year, probably at all. Like, there's just no way. But to say, like, that's really what it needs is about 1,000 points of contact. Most things that get sustainability need about 1,000 points of contact in order for you to be to have critical mass to do whatever it is you're trying to do in a particular context. So you're always doing one-on-ones. There's not, for a planter or a team that's planting a new community, you're never not having one-on-ones with people outside of the church, and asking them what the hopes and hurts are for a particular community, and inviting them to come and tell you how they see the plant. You need their eyes, no matter if it's a community that's only been around for a year or 10 years. I think we're coming up on our limit of time soon, aren't we, Katie? We thought we would end early.
We are. I know. This one really gripped some folks' imaginations and attention. Good. And Diane, Bishop Diane, I know you had to jump on a little bit late, but I'm going to also post this recording, and I'll make sure I email it to you so you can hear what all happened at the beginning.
Thank you.
Jason, what was that book that you held up? I thought I might just type that into the...
Get Together. The authors are Bailey Richardson, Kevin Hune, and K. Elmer Soto. I can type that out.
Oh, perfect.
And
Yeah.
pardon me for a question as a latecomer. Which book of Rendell's were you working with?
Doing the Math for Mission.
Okay. Okay.
I think you mentioned that before.
I have, yeah.
Yeah, I just missed it. I was late getting in, for which I apologize.
We'll forgive you this time. Just don't make it happen again, okay?
I'll do my best.
Good. Jason, thank you so much. And thank you all for all this good conversation that we have had. This is really awesome and amazing what happens when you put some heads and stories together. Janet, I think that in May, you are tackling our next topic, if that sounds familiar.
It sounds vaguely familiar.
Vaguely familiar.
Topic it is, but there's been a lot of water under the bridge in the last few weeks.
There has, since we started talking about this. I have that May 12th, which should be the second Tuesday of the month. Janet will be leading us in a conversation about how to support your church plant and your church planter. So while that's specifically designed for diocesan leaders, bishops, canons, etc., it wouldn't hurt for some church planters to be on there as well, maybe to even offer up some stories about times you felt really supported or best practices for diocesan leaders to take on. Anything else you want to say about that, Janet?
Nope, that's always a lively conversation because we collectively have done some things really well and some things not so well. So.
Fantastic. Good. So we will hope to see you all in May. And again, invite anyone that you would like or think would benefit from this kind of conversation to join in. Good. All right. Take care.
Thanks for hosting, Katie.
Thank you all.
This recording will be posted soon.
Jason, thank you.
Jason.
Take care, friends. Good to be with you all.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.